So welcome to this fall course of Outsmarting Anti-Semitism. It's a important topic. It's a busy topic. It's a very emotional topic, and it has caused much grief, much interest, and lots of feelings in the past 3,000 years, really, or even more, since we're a nation. And really, for as long as there have been Jews, there has been anti-Semitism and Jewish jokes about anti-Semitism. There's no shortage of the Jewish jokes about anti-Semitism. Firstly, before we continue, I'd like to thank our sponsors who sponsored this class and sponsor all of our classes throughout the year, all the sponsors, but for this class in particular, the Kalmansons, Dr. Herman, and Mr. Robert Rubin. Thank you very much for sponsoring this class. May God Almighty bless you, all of you, with lots of health, happiness, and nachas from your children and grandchildren in all areas, and lots of success in all areas. So as long as there has been anti-Semitism, there's been Jewish jokes. And they say the famous joke of following the assassination of Tsar Alexander in 1881, a government official approaches a rabbi and he growls, "I assume you know who was behind it." So the rabbi replies, "Look, I have no idea, but I'm sure the government is soon going to blame the Jews and the milkmen." So the government official turns to the rabbi and says, "Why the milkmen?" So the rabbi says, "Well, why the Jews?" When it comes to anti-Semitism, we've all had our experiences, we've all had our run-ins. But unfortunately, anti-Semitism is not just a discussion of the past, it's something which goes on today. It's something which in the past 2 decades has someone had an uptick, as you can see in pages 3, 4, 5, some of the studies that have been done in the prior couple decades regarding anti-Semitism, how it seems to be that there is quite an uptick in anti-Semitism. And even those who say that there's more reporting and we know more about it, which seems to be there is some truth to that, but overall it does seem that there is more anti-Semitism, more anti-Semitic incidents in the past 2 decades than there have been in the latter half of the 20th century. And so it gives a feeling to Jews, as you see if on page 3 and 4, which are statistics for English Jews, that the uptick in the feelings of anti-Semitism, the feeling of not feeling welcomed, the feeling of wanting to leave their country for Israel because of feelings of anti-Semitism. So there's definitely an uptick in that area. The question really is, and perhaps noticing this uptick and noticing this idea that it is a concerning concept, I'd like to stress what today's course and the coming weeks, what we will discuss, what it's about and what it's not about. For many Jews, beginning in so what is this course not about? It's not about what anti-Semites think about us. It's not about all the anti-Semitic incidents of the past or of the current anti-Semitic incidents. It's not about overemphasizing anti-Semitism and how terrible it is and how we have to hide our Judaism. And it's an interesting reason why we're not focusing on that. You see, in the last half, beginning really in the 20th century, it's at the turn of the century, and it would get even in the latter half of the 20th century, it got even greater focus on that. There's been a great emphasis on never again. There's been a great emphasis of anti-Semitism being a significant component of people's Jewish identity. And as you see on figure 1.6 on page 8, the Pew study of American Jews in 2013, they asked many people, Jews, of what is important to their Jewish identity, what is essential to being Jewish. And the response that was selected more than any other was remembering the Holocaust, which to a degree gives us a feeling that being Jewish is perceived by many people as being a response and in reaction to anti-Semites and episodes of anti-Semitism. And this isn't healthy. It's not really, now remembering our painful past and being vigilant and doing everything that we could to stop it is important. But that it defines what it means to be Jewish is not justified. And is an interesting perspective by Devorah Lipstadt. You may have heard of her. She's a famous Holocaust historian. Many court cases have happened with her. She's a professor at Emory University and the chair of the Jewish Studies at Emory University. And she writes as follows. It's on page 9, text 1a. Leah, can you read it for us?
Most Jews will immediately step forward when Jews anywhere are being attacked by anti-Semites. This is, of course, as it should be. What is regrettable, however, is that some Jews, the fight against anti-Semitism becomes the sum total of their Jewish identity. Recently, a much respected Jewish communal leader lamented to me that he regretted not having educated his children about Jewish traditions and culture. He was, however, very proud of the fact that he embedded within them a total intolerance of anti-Semitism. His kids were prepared to be at the barricades to do battle against this hatred and many others as well. His comments made me sad. Anti-Semitism has become the drummer to which his family's Jewish identity marches. They know of a Jew as object, not subject. In other words, what is done to Jews becomes far more significant than what Jews do. This well-intentioned Jewish father has deprived his children of a rich, multifaceted legacy. They have been taught to see themselves mainly as perennial victims. This leads to the oppressor control over one's destiny. It leaves many Jews, including the man's children, aware of what to be against, but not what to be for.
Thank you. So what drives us personally as Jews should not be the persecution of Jews, should not be anti-Semitism. It should be our rich tradition and its teachings, the Torah and the mitzvahs. And as Barry Weiss, the famous columnist, put it so eloquently, I think it was just last year at the Solidarity March in New York. It was a whole speech, but in the speech, she said the following line, text 1b, the Jewish people were not put on earth to be anti-Semites. We were put on earth to be Jews. Which is a very important line because even if we're not using anti-Semitism to be the basis of our Judaism, it's still problematic if we overemphasize it. Because if we overemphasize it, means we're putting too much focus on negativity. And our children, the next generation, don't want to have anything to do with that. Why be associated with something which is so negative? And so this course is not a rallying call to direct our Jewishness toward the fight against anti-Semitism. It's not to get us bogged down in negativity. It's not to get us bogged down in addressing these ideas. What it is to address real questions about Jew hatred. And as you see on page 11, we're going to address what are some tools to cope with the fear that's brought upon by and anxiety that's brought upon by anti-Semitism. What role does faith play in that response? How do we do our part to reduce anti-Semitism, and various other important questions? Now, this idea of focusing on the negativity of Judaism brings to mind that line from Fiddler on the Roof, where Tevye, I think it's Tevye, who says, I know we're your chosen people, but can't you choose someone else for a chance? We don't want the next generation to be worried about that. We don't want the next generation to be all caught up with that anxiety. And so we're going to focus on the idea of what happens when we encounter anti-Semitism. What is something that we encounter when we hear of an anti-Semitic incident, when we experience anti-Semitism on our own? what is that knee-jerk reaction? What is that first feeling that we have following an anti-Semitic incident? And if you have such feeling, you can put it down to paper on page 12. Those three questions. Have you experienced something? What was the incident that you're keeping in mind? What were your feelings immediately after that incident? And what were the actions that you or others took following that incident? Natural feelings is a feeling of fear. Natural feelings is anxiety, anger. There are many, many feelings that come to place. And if you'd like to post it in the chat box, a feeling that comes to mind when you experience anti-Semitism or when you heard of an anti-Semitic incident, if you can drop it in the box, a one-word answer of a feeling in the chat box of a feeling that you experience. Hurt, shock, awful, anxiety. These are some good shock. Okay, there's one that we touched upon. There's one more that I'm looking for. If anyone has any other feelings that that they've had, and it's definitely a feeling that I've heard other people mention to me. Helplessness, fear. Okay, there we go. So one is a very common mention twice here: anxiety and fear. Fear, it's natural for us to be fearful. We see these episodes, we see the graphs, we see the data happening. It causes fear in us. And it causes us to go ahead and do something about it, right? Lobby the government to try to see if they can place more police cars, if we can have more security, if we can do something more about saving us from this situation. But the idea with fear, Jewish tradition tells us that fear and worrying can also be very, very dangerous. Here's an interesting quote from the Talmud, which quotes King Solomon. Text 2 on page 13. The Talmud says as follows: it is stated in the book of Ben Sirach, do not allow anxiety into your heart, for anxiety has killed the mighty. And King Solomon said the same: if there is anxiety in your heart, quash it. Excessive worrying cripples us. It's unconstructive. They say, there's a famous saying, worry is like a rocking chair. You go back and forth without getting anywhere. Worrying freezes us. We're not capable of a proper response. And we start getting worried and anxious about every little thing. We get worried that everyone and every statement and everything is anti-Semitism. We start calling out anti-Semitism when perhaps it isn't. It makes us find anti-Semitism everywhere. And it also causes us to take away our focus from the real issues and approach them wisely and effectively. But perhaps the most important aspect, if we're constantly focusing on the worry and the anxiety, and the next generation hears it, it's a constant. There's anti-Semitism, and what are we doing about it? And there's news reports about anti-Semitism, and there's a constant speak about this one and that one is an anti-Semite. The young generation doesn't want to have any part in it. The young generation of Jews says, what type of joy is there in being a part of this community that's constantly anxious? I want nothing to do with it. What great pride is there in always worrying about that I'm going to be the next victim? And so we have to make sure to have a balance between caution and preparedness and making sure that that doesn't turn into worry. So the question really is what? What can we do to ensure that the caution and preparedness doesn't turn into worry? And how do we make sure that we're not anxious? We're not constantly concerned about this at all times. And like Stephen mentioned in the beginning of the class, it's something that people ask me all the time because, I walk around looking like, as my father once told someone who walked into his store and said, how come you don't sell the Star of David in your store? He sells jewelry. And so my father said, I can sell to people in Borough Park. We're walking stars of David. We don't need to wear a Star of David. I'm a walking Star of David. There's no way I can hide my Judaism, right? It's on my hat. I got my yarmulke, my beard, my tzitzis. As I wrote in the first email, true story, about 2 months ago, someone stopped me in Rouse and said, what's the spaghetti hanging out of your pants? I got my tzitzis, it's there. And so people ask me, how are you not worried, constantly worried? You're not looking over your back? No, I've never looked over my back. I've never been worried. And how do we make sure that it doesn't turn to worry? And so that's where we get to. There's 3 different points that we're going to analyze tonight on how to make sure to be cautious, to be prepared, but to ensure that it doesn't turn to anxiety and worry. The first point that we have, we're a miraculous people. The second point is to consider the full picture. And the third point is to keep in mind, I fear not because you are with me, you being God. And we're going to address each point individually. So we'll begin with the miraculous people, right? We quoted earlier Devorah Lipstadt, the historian, the chair of Holocaust studies and Jewish studies at Emory University, famous writer and author about Holocaust studies. And so we're not belittling anti-Semitism, but perhaps we're trying to figure out how to reduce fear. And so she writes as follows, text 3 on page 14. The fact that we're here is such a historical anomaly. It makes no sense. So sometimes when I'm asked about anti-Semitism, people will say, well, how can you be optimistic in all this? How can you see the positive? It's such a dreary situation. And I say, because we shouldn't be here. And the fact that we are here shouldn't be taken for granted. See, the eternity of the Jewish people is something from the Torah. It's something that God tells us that we are here eternally. We're not going anywhere. It's a promise that God told us that we will be here. And it's something that has been stressed time and time again. After the class, you can look at, I think it's on page, there's the additional readings of lesson 1, quotes from the gamut of history, Jewish sages and Lavdil, non-Jewish writers and historians. Mark Twain famously wrote the Jewish conundrum, I think he titled it. I remember what he titled it. But how are the Jews still around? It's something which is beyond any historical aspect. And it's highlighted greatly with the Yemen question. You see, the Jews in Yemen in 1168 were faced with a very tough situation. Yemen was then controlled by a fanatical Muslim cleric who became the ruler of Yemen, and he decreed that his Jewish subjects must convert to Islam or else. And we all know what or else meant. Not only that, there was an apostate. There was someone who was, he was a Jew, and he converted to Islam. And he wrote that, not only he wrote, he would preach, and he constantly telling it to everyone that Judaism is no longer important. Islam superseded Judaism. And which is why the Jews must yield to the ruler's demand and convert to Islam. And on top of that, there was an imposter Messiah who proclaimed to be himself the Messiah, and he added to the confusion of the time. The Jews of Yemen were at a total loss. And so they reached out to Maimonides, who I believe at the time was living in Egypt. So it was a far trip, but it wasn't that far. They reached out to Maimonides, and Maimonides wrote his famous letter to the Jews of Yemen in Geras Teman. If you have time, it's a fascinating letter that Maimonides writes to these Jews of Yemen to strengthen them to counter each one of these arguments and to speak greatly about Jewish survival. But in his letter, what's important for our discussion, he writes the following. On page 15, text 4.
It's dust.
Yeah.
Okay. God assured our father Jacob early on that although the nations would enslave his descendants, treat them cruelly, and subjugate them, his children would survive and endure, whereas those who enslaved them would eventually disappear. God told him, your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. Although they are destined to be trampled and downtrodden, as everyone tramples the dust of the earth, they will overcome and triumph in the end. Just as, to continue the analogy, the dust eventually rises over those who trampled upon it when their corpses are buried. So Israel will remain in existence, whereas those who have trodden upon her will not. The Creator similarly assured us through his prophets that we will never be destroyed, that he will never permit our annihilation, and that we will never stray from being a nation devoted to its purpose. Just as it is impossible for God's own existence to be nullified, so it is impossible that we should be destroyed and eliminated from the world. So spoke Malachi, I'm God, and I have not changed, and you, the children of Jacob, have not been destroyed.
Thank you. So what we have here is this idea, this miracle of Jewish survival that has baffled historians and sociologists for generations upon generations, has its root in a promise that God promised Jacob and the rest of the entirety of the Jewish people, that no matter what happens to us as a people, we will survive and we will thrive. We're here for the long run. We're not going anywhere. Try as they may, we are not going anywhere. Judaism will never be eradicated. The Torah tells us how Jacob was fleeing from his brother Esau, and that's when God gave him the promise, amongst other things, that despite the difficulties, the Jews are an eternal people just like God himself. And so while recent events may have placed us on guard, the unmistakable fact is that the Jewish people will survive and thrive. The knowledge that we are members of a supernaturally eternal nation should trigger inner pride and confidence in our future. And it did to the people in Yemen, whom Maimonides was addressing. It strengthened them, and they remained true to their religion, true to Judaism, even with the terrible decrees that were going on in their time. Another point to ponder, and that is, we're thinking about this idea, great, we're going to survive, we're going to thrive, but along the way, I'm afraid that, God forbid, me or perhaps other people have and will suffer and endure too much suffering. Therefore, it's important to look at the current situation. We did mention in the beginning that there has been a seeming rise in anti-Semitic incidents in the past 2 decades. And as you see in this graph, this is taken from the ADL, there has been a rise in anti-Semitic incidents, but it's important to put it in historical perspective. Historically, governments were the ones that perpetuated and perpetrated governments were the ones who perpetuated and perpetrated these incidents of anti-Semitism. There were people in these governments, kings, emperors, leaders, tyrants, dictators. They were the ones who caused the anti-Semitism. There were anti-Semitic decrees that happened. It was implemented in the laws and the policies. There were laws and policies even here in the United States. I think it was Boca Raton, one of the most famous Jewish cities. I think it's 96% Jewish now. Boca Raton had a sign, no Jews or dogs, no Jews, dogs, or blacks. And it wasn't that long ago, right? In Europe, it was government law. Jews weren't allowed to be in England until I think it was the 14th century. It was illegal for Jews to be in England. And there were no Jews. It was governments who did that. Not only that, it was that people lived in fear of their life every moment of breathing, every moment of being awake. As we hear that, and we know the stories from stories of old, not just of old, 100 years ago, 150 years ago. Nowadays, we don't have governments that perpetrate and perpetuate these ideas. Yes, we do have isolated incidents. Yes, it may have been coming, but you know what? 100 years ago in the United States, anti-Semitism was abound in the United States. The first, if I'm not mistaken, the first Jewish ambassador, all the way back in 1812, was sent to Tunis to be an ambassador. His name was Manuel Noah, Mordechai Manuel Noah. He was the first Jewish ambassador from the United States. He was sent to Tunis. He was recalled after 3 years instead of 5 years. Blatant anti-Semitism. The reason that was given why he was recalled was because he's a Jew, and being a Jew will interfere with his government's duties. That was the first time. It was blatant anti-Semitism in the government. Jews couldn't serve in certain positions. In Maryland, if I'm not mistaken, it was Maryland. In Maryland, it was part of the constitution of the state that in order to hold public office, you had to accept the Catholic religion. So Jews couldn't hold a public office. In many instances, it was even here in the United States. And nowadays, we don't have that. Most Jews, the vast majority of Jews, live in countries that are, granted, there are anti-Semitic incidents, but the government isn't the one that's perpetrating and perpetuating these anti-Semitic incidents. Our situation today has improved tremendously, drastically. Not only that, look at the graph on page on page 18. The ADL, right, who spoke about the anti-Semitic incidents that's growing in the United States. The ADL has a yearly study about stereotypes of Jews, index questions. They ask a series of questions of stereotypes. Do people believe in these stereotypes? In 1964, 29% of Americans believed in more than 6 of these stereotypes, held them as firm beliefs, accepted them. That was the attitude. So 29% of people in the United States in 1964 were anti-Semites. Nowadays, it's gone down drastically to 11%, and it's basically been 11% for the past 20, 30 years. So what we have here is really 2 truths. What we have here, yes, on the one hand, anti-Semitic incidents have gone up, but anti-Semitism, anti-Semites have gone down. There are less. Anti-Semitic incidents have gone up. Anti-Semitic attitudes, especially in the United States, there's been a decline. And so in our minds, we got to keep this in mind, that the current reality is nowhere close, is not in the same league at all to anything that occurred to the Jewish nation in the past 3,000 to 4,000 years. And so, yes, there has been a rise in anti-Semitic incidents, but there's been a tremendous decline in anti-Semitic attitudes from a government perspective and from the local people. And so keeping this reality in mind can help us keep us from becoming dejected and give us a certain confidence necessary to address anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that still lurks out there. Which leads us to the third point, which should alleviate our fear and anxiety. What's the most often repeated 2-word phrase in the entire Tanakh, in the entire 24 books of the Jewish canon, the 5 books of Moses and the books of the prophets and the scriptures? What is the most often repeated 2-word phrase in the entire Tanakh? Anyone have any suggestions? Feel free to put them in the chat box. No one? No suggestions? No thoughts? Come on, we all study Torah. The most often repeated 2-word phrase in the Torah is al tira, do not fear. It's the most often repeated 2-word phrase. It is found in the Torah 44 times. If you include the plural of al tira, it's in the Torah 70 times. And if you include other variations, it's found in the Torah 110 times. It's told to Abraham, it's told to Isaac, it's told to Jacob, it's told to Jews throughout all the generations. Al tira. It appears so many times in the Torah to instill that although life is filled with unsettling moments, there's still no room for dread and for panic, for fear and anxiety, because God is always in complete control over everything that occurs. And King David put it famously and so eloquently in Psalm 23, and many of us are familiar with Psalm 23, text 6. Ben, would you like to read for us? Text 6, page 21.
Sure. Nobody told me that I had a delivery when I got home from the office today. Okay. A song of David. God is my shepherd, I shall not lack. He allows me to lay down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Even if I walk in the valley of death's shadow, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me.
King David is calling God his shepherd. King David knew what his shepherd was because he was a shepherd. And the Midrash tells us, so why is he calling God a shepherd? Not because it's a nice association or because it's something, it evokes certain feelings, but because he knows exactly what a shepherd is. A shepherd is someone who takes, when it comes to pastures, King David, when he would bring his sheep to the pastures, he'd bring the youngest sheep to the pastures first, so they would be able to feed on the soft grass. Then he would bring the old animals to the feeding ground so that they would be able to eat the regular grass. Only then would he bring the regular, middle-aged, strong sheep, strong animals, so they can munch on the grass that's not fresh, that's not soft, it's harder, but they're able to do it. In other words, he was able to give everyone exactly what they needed. And so King David chose to designate God as a shepherd. In other words, showing and saying that God provides for all of his needs, be it green pastures, be it still waters, be it the cup that runneth over. King David was saying, I'm not worried. King David had his fair share of terror that went on in his life. Many people who tried to kill him actively, chased him for many, many years trying to kill him. But King David is saying, I never worried because I know that I'm in God's hands. Nothing is going to happen. And I'd like to share here an interesting video, a clip that really drives this point home of King David.
In January 1948, in the dark hours of the Soviet Union, a child was born in Stalino who was destined to symbolize mighty struggles. A bitter, global struggle between the bald eagle and the brown bear in the throes of their Cold War. A lopsided struggle between terrifying tyranny and human rights, between brutally enforced atheism and the free soul of a believer, between monstrous anti-Semitism and a proud Jew, and between the temptation to collapse and the superhuman will to survive. Nathan Sharansky graduated from Moscow's Physical Technical Institute before joining the underground human rights movement, reclaiming his Jewish heritage and emerging as a foremost dissident and spokesman for human rights. In 1973, Nathan took the calculated risk of applying for an exit visa to Israel. He was denied and rose to the forefront of Jewish refusnik activities.
Well, I was in the middle of the struggle when the situation looked very dangerous, when some of my friends in Helsinki group were already arrested, when new wave of repressions against Jewish activists was clearly prepared. And at this time I received a note from my wife Avital through some American Jewish tourists. And together with this note, a small psalm book. And Avital writes that this psalm book was with me in the last year when I was trying to help you in different places in the world. And I have a feeling that the time has come to send it to you. And I opened the book and I can't read there anything because I never learned how to read these texts. And also, most of the words I don't know. Many of the words I know, about 1,000 words, mainly of our daily struggle, prison, repressions, demonstrations, but not these words. So I decided I don't have time for these small things when I'm very busy now in organizing demonstrations and press conferences, and almost forgot.
In 1977, he was arrested on false charges of spying for the United States. But prior to the announcement of his verdict, he famously declared, "To the court I have nothing to say. To my wife and the Jewish people I say, next year in Jerusalem." Sentenced to 13 years imprisonment, he spent the next 16 months some 1,600 miles away from Jerusalem, in Moscow's Lefortovo prison, often in solitary confinement and in a special torture cell before being transferred to a Siberian labor camp.
They bring me the list of things that they confiscated, and there is mentioned this small black book, not in Russian. And I understand that they are talking about this psalm book, which was sent to by Vital. And then I remember this note which is sent. And I demand that they'll give it to me, and it was a long struggle. 3 years after I was arrested, they returned this book to me, together with the telegram from my mother that my father passed away. And it's, of course, it's difficult when, it's always difficult, but when you cannot be with your family. And I decided that the only thing which I can do, I will be reading this psalm book until I understand. And so I'm reading these hundreds of thousands of words where I cannot understand where the sentence begins and ends, and cannot understand more than half of the words. And then simply comparing between different places of these words, I try to find out the connection between them. And it so happened that the first phrase from all these hundreds of thousands of words was a short phrase of 13 very short words, which I understood fully. That is the phrase, Gam ki elech bagay salamavet lo ira ra ki ata imadi. It's from the Psalm Kav Gimel, and when you'll go through the valley of shadow of death, you'll fear no evil because you are with me. And that was very powerful. It was very important for me. And each time when they were taking it from me, I was fighting and on hunger strikes, refusing to work, sometimes refusing to eat until they'll bring it to me back.
He resisted and persisted with remarkable courage. His miracle dawned in 1986 when he was released in a prisoner exchange. Leading Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Shimon Peres, welcomed him to Jerusalem.
And even when they already took me from prison and replaced all my clothes, I was lying in the snow refusing to enter the airplane without getting this book back because I felt that all my strength is there. So that was the only piece of property which I took from prison, and all these years it's always with me, and it gives me a lot of strength.
The Hebrew phrases in Sharansky's Petite Black Book were authored 28 centuries earlier by King David, who reigned from the splendid city of which Sharansky dreamed, Jerusalem. It was he who crafted the powerful line of prophetic poetry that lent indestructible hope and undefeatable strength to endless generations of Jews in distress. Even if I must tread through a valley forged by death's own shadow, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. A fountain of eternal confidence generated on behalf of each Jew in every century in the face of the mightiest and most monstrous obstacles. You are not alone. God is with you. Walk with confidence. The Creator of the universe stands guard at your side.
This idea, if we take it for a moment and we stop and we think about it, we imagine how our lives would be different with this type of trust and building, if we could build this type of trust into our thinking. Now, perhaps, we have some questions, academic questions on this concept, but let's imagine the benefits of such a worldview and the benefits that such a worldview has to offer. It's true that even some people who believe in God have a difficult time trusting in God, and that's usually something because there's no precedent. But if we stop for a moment and we think, hey, is there really no precedent? We think about all the good that has happened to us personally, life, happiness, family, whatever good we have in our lives. We wake up in the morning, various things, however cliche and insignificant it may seem. We think about all the good that God has given to us, the way that God treats us like we are his sheep and he's our shepherd, directing us, giving us everything that we need. And if we stop taking these blessings for granted, but as granted by God to us, we'll suddenly find robust precedent upon which to build this trust in God. And indeed, we begin each week with the Havdalah ceremony, within which we read the verse, text 7. Indeed, God is my deliverance. I am confident and I shall not fear. For God is my strength and my praise, and he has been my salvation. Does this mean we should expect everything to be rosy, everything to be smooth sailing? No. King David, remember, calls God his shepherd, and King David mentions about God, the shepherd's rod and staff, right? A shepherd sometimes uses his rod and staff. Well, King David is saying that although I know you're my shepherd, and although there are challenges, and there's the rod from the shepherd, I know it's you, and I know it's God, and I know it's God who's with me every step of the way, guiding me, supporting me, encouraging me, and knowing this is what enabled King David to remain calm and without stress. And many times we have incidents of stress and anxiety in our life, whatever it may be, not just anti-Semitism. And we find comfort in speaking to a close friend, a family member, talking it over with them, having that conversation, listening to others, having others listen to us. King David saw God as such a friend, someone who King David spoke to, knowing that God is there with him. And the same is true for many Jews throughout this long and terrible exile. Text 8 and 9. Whenever Jews are persecuted, says the Midrash, the godly presence is, so to speak, persecuted along with them. As it is stated, in all of their pain, he is pained. God is with us wherever we are. God's watching over us. And if we place our trust in him, it enables us, like King David, to take a step back, not be anxious, not be fearful, because God is with us. And as the verse tells us, those who trust in God will be surrounded by benevolence. When we trust exclusively in God's loving hands, that he will tend to our needs in the best way, we open up the channels for God's blessings to be there for us, keeping us healthy and secure. We have to constantly remind ourselves of this fact, that I will fear no evil because God is with me. So keeping these 3 points in mind, the idea that we're a miraculous nation, we prevailed throughout history, the idea that, look at the bigger picture and how wonderful society is nowadays comparatively to our entire history. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the idea of do not fear because I am with you. God is our shepherd. God is with us, guiding us, encouraging us, helping us, and giving us, placing our trust in God, should alleviate that fear, that anxiety that we may have when we hear of an anti-Semitic incident, or perhaps when one, God forbid, occurs to us. Addressing these emotions brings us to the next step. And the next step is, what are the actions that we take? What action do we take? We have optimism, we have faith, we're not going to be anxious, we're not going to be fearful, but what do we do? What are the positive steps that we take? And really the question is not just what are the positive steps that we take. Do we have to take any positive steps? Do we have to take any steps to combat anti-Semitism? If God is our shepherd, God's going to help us. Place our trust in God, sit back, relax, and watch the show unfold and how everything's going to be all fine and dandy. We can ask this question about anything in Judaism. Why do we pray? Why do we go to work? God's going to give us everything. Why should we do anything? But here we're going to focus on the question in this context of anti-Semitism. Why do anything? God's our shepherd. God's going to take care of us. He's going to guide us. What should we do? And so we're going to explore the story of Purim. And we're not just going to explore it tonight. We're going to explore it for the next few classes, which will give us tremendous insight into this idea, because Purim is one of those early stories where the anti-Semitism is documented so detailed, and the response from the Jewish leaders is also documented and was a successful response. Just to recap the story of Purim, we're familiar with it. I'm sorry, we're going to go over time tonight. We had a few hiccups along the way. We started late, but hopefully next week we'll start on time, we'll end on time. The story of Purim, a quick recap, took place about 27 2,600 years ago in Persia, in what is today Iran. As a matter of fact, the tradition has it, according to some tradition, that Mordechai and Esther, the heroes of the Purim story, are buried in Iran. And there's an actual tombstone you can go visit. It's still there. And so it took place in Iran about 2,600 years ago when there was a decree to annihilate the Jewish people. Right? Haman, the wicked man, he convinced Achashverosh or Ahasuerus, the leader of the king of that time, to kill the Jewish people, and the Jewish people emerged victorious. What was the key that they emerged victorious? The key was that Esther, the queen, was Jewish. She was Mordechai's first cousin, the leader of the Jewish people, Mordechai. She was his first cousin, and Mordechai directed her on how to utilize her power as the queen to abolish this decree. And here we'll read it where that plan takes place. Text 10 on page 25. Esther, this is a quote from the book of Esther, chapter 4. Esther dictated a message to be sent back to Mordechai. Esther finds out about the decree from Mordechai because Mordechai is sitting at the gates of the palace in sackcloth and ash. Esther sends some clothing for him to get dressed in proper clothing, and he sends back the message, there's a decree for our annihilation. And so Esther devises a plan. She sends back a message to Mordechai. Go and assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan, the capital city. Let them fast on my behalf. Let them neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night and day. I and my maidens will fast likewise. And then I shall go to the king, although it is contrary to the law. And if I am to perish, I shall perish. Mordechai went ahead and implemented all that Esther had commanded him. On the third day, Esther donned her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of King's palace. Esther's going to try diplomacy. She's going to go and try to meet her husband, the king, although it's against the law for her to arrive unannounced. And she's going to try to work her way, charm her way into abolishing this decree of destroying the Jewish people. But what's going on here? She's trying to use her charm for her husband, the king, to charm her way into convincing him to abolish this thing. But what does she do? She fasts for 3 days and 3 nights. Not only all the Jewish people, she fasts. We all know what we look like after the 24 hours of Yom Kippur. We're ready to pass out. We look pale and frail, and we're done. Imagine doing Yom Kippur 3 times consecutively, 72 hours, no eating, no drinking, and then she's going to go to Achashverosh. So much for charming him into saving the Jewish people. Why is she taking that risk? Got it, she's trying to be holy, she's trying to, but what's she doing? And so Hasidic thought explains this question, this important question, as follows. Jewish people living in the desert, how did they survive? They had the manna. The manna was wonderful. They ate, they drank from Miriam's well, their clothing was cleaned and changed and grew with them. They didn't have to do anything additional for them. It was all laid out on a silver platter for them the entire year, 40 years in the desert. They saw God, literally, everything was handed to them. What happened after that? Once the Jews entered Israel, even now during exile, it's not handed to us. We got to work for it. And on top of that, we don't see God, right? We don't see God in it. We go to work. We want to make a living. We go to work. We make a living. We work hard. We get a paycheck. Now we have money. We don't work hard. We don't get a paycheck. We don't make money. So what's going on here? According to Hasidic tradition, what's going on here is that at the time of the Jewish people in the desert, when they had the manna, God provided. Nowadays, we're creating it. It's a partnership between us and God. Now, some believers have the idea that the partnership is God gives us the raw materials. God gives us what we need. God gives us, life and family, whatever, health, and we can see, we can hear. And now it's up to us to go ahead and utilize those materials that God has given us and close it out. Go ahead and work hard with those materials that God given us. According to Hasidic teaching, It's not like that. It's a partnership, but it's a different type of partnership. What type of partnership it is? The idea nowadays, way God provides is not that much different from the way God provided in the desert. God provided in the desert in a miraculous form. God provides now in a miraculous form. When we get that paycheck, when we have food on our table that is just as miraculous as the money, it is coming directly from God. But there's one difference, and that is there's something that we have to do to enable this to happen. We have to give God the space to act. What that means is that we have this interesting paradox. On the one hand, everything in the world, every blessing in terms of earnings, health, happiness, security, it all comes from God. On the other hand, if things were open and manifest, if things were clearly from God, we'd see it clearly from God, the world would not be a place of concealment. It'll be just as miraculous in the desert, and that's not what God wants. God wants it to be a concealment. So God wants the world to be a concealment so that our relationship with him should be a choice, that we recognize the divinity in our blessings, which would allow for a truer and deeper connection because it's coming from our choice. But on the other hand, it comes from God. And so how do we reconcile this paradox? What we do is, that's where our action kicks in. We create the concealment. For example, in the context of earning a livelihood, we provide a service to another who's willing to pay for it. This allows us to feel that the income was generated by the service we provided. But in the context of security, for example, we hire security guards, which allows us to feel that the protection is being provided by these means. And this is what God is waiting for. Because when we do those actions, those are suitable spaces for God to provide his blessings without being noticed. He can still retain the aspect of concealment and still give us everything that we need. Is this a partnership between us and God? Absolutely. 100% is a partnership between us and God. But it's not that he gives us the raw materials and then we do the rest and we take it the rest of the way. No, it's that God needs us to create an environment where he does the whole thing. So there's the famous saying, right? God helps those who help themselves, which is not a quote from any Jewish source. But perhaps Jewishly, we can put that quote and say, God helps those who make it appear as though they are helping themselves. Now, this isn't intuitive because we think when we work, we're making money. When we don't work, we don't make money. No, when we work, we're making that concealment. We're giving space for God to give us that blessing. The blessing comes from God. Is it just semantics? Is it just this idea? So is it coming from God or is it coming from our work, but it's all the same? Does it really change anything? What's the upshot of this perspective? What does it change anything in a practical sense? And the reality is it does. How does it change something in a practical sense? It changes something in a practical sense because what we are doing, we're working on creating a natural vehicle. That's all we're doing. We have to make that natural vehicle. So efforts in the realm of the spiritual realm are just as important, if not more important, than creating the natural vehicle. Because the natural vehicle is just for us to create that sense of concealment, to create that sense that we are doing something to make that money. But really that livelihood is coming from who? It's coming from God. So we just have to make that vehicle. But remember, where's the provisions coming from? It's coming from God. And so the spiritual side of it is perhaps more important than the natural, than the materialistic side of it. Because if we want God's blessings, we have to make sure that we're doing the best that we possibly could in the spiritual realm. We want to increase those blessings. Let's increase our efforts in the spiritual realm because that's where the true blessing comes from. It's coming from God. We just have to make that materialistic vehicle, that way where God can put those blessings. We got to open the bank accounts. We got to go to work, because if we don't, we're not making that vessel. But once we go to work, that's where God will shower us with those blessings. And in order to make sure we have those blessings, we got to strengthen and deepen our relationship with God through faith, through prayer, through study Torah, and through performing of mitzvahs. It's said this idea is regarding things that are under our control. How much more so areas which is beyond our control, like anti-Semitism. The idea that we're here, a nation so many thousands of years later, this concept is an open miracle that we're here thousands of years later. It's beyond anything that nature tells us. And if it's so beyond anything nature tells us, then not only do we have to make that natural vehicle, do our best in the natural realm to lobby government professionals, government officials, and so on and so forth, but the spiritual vehicle has to be even greater. And that takes us back to the story of Esther. Here was Esther. She knew that where's her salvation going to come from? It's not going to come from the fact that she's a queen. It's not going to come from her interceding on behalf of the Jewish people through her husband, the king Ahasuerus, and that will abolish the decree. No, that's not where it's coming from. It's coming from God. She has to do her part to make a natural vehicle in this realm, in this world, by going to meet Ahasuerus. Because if she doesn't meet him, then the miracle can't take hold. But in order for God's blessing to come, she has to step up her spiritual game. So making sure that the spiritual vehicle, that the materialistic vehicle, the natural vehicle, the going to Ahasuerus is in tip-top condition, that's not as important as making sure that her spiritual game is in tip-top situation. So we got a question here. The richer man is because he's honoring God more. The richer a man is, the more he is honoring God. In some instances, the Talmud tells us that Rebbe, the great Rabbi Judah the Prince, he used to honor rich people, because he said, if God gave you so much money, it's because God is giving you lots of his blessings. I wouldn't necessarily put that on all rich people, but it definitely has some truth to it. So back to Esther, that's why Esther felt, to make sure her charm is in tip-top condition, to make sure that she eats well and dresses herself up well before she goes to Ahasuerus, that's not so important, because she just has to make that vehicle. What's more important is for her to fast, to step up her spiritual game. As we see in text 12 on page 32. Dr. Herman, can you read for us on page 32, text 12?
A second. Yeah. Okay. Esther's conduct demonstrated that she considered her act of approaching Ahasuerus as a mere garment for God's salvation, knowing that it would be in fact knowing it would in fact be an entirely supernatural miracle. It was therefore necessary that the Jews first pray and fast to become worthy of such a miracle. Nevertheless, because God desired that the supernatural salvation should appear to be within the natural order, Mordecai instructed Esther to make an appeal to Ahasuerus, despite the grave risk. Consequently, it was not of great significance for the features of the garment to meet all the demands of the natural order. For the primary concern was not the medium through which God's salvation would arrive, but rather the need to ensure that the cause for salvation had been secured.
Thank you. So what's particularly noteworthy about the story is that it's not that the Jewish people didn't have recourse in a different manner through nature. They had. The most powerful person, second to the king, was a Jew, right? The vice president was a Jew. Imagine that. Perhaps that would be problematic. Joe Lieberman almost made it. But the queen was Jewish. They had enough recourse naturally to go ahead and try to influence and change the situation. It wasn't that the fasting and praying was a last ditch effort. It's what they chose to do. That was what they chose to do. Because that's what Judaism teaches us, that the way we strengthen and receive God's blessing is by tapping into our relationship with God and improving it. And that is the key to receiving God's blessing through a physical garment that we make. We'll conclude with an interesting story that took place back in 1991. It's we can talk about it and read it in the text, or I can share a video. So I'm going to share a 5-minute clip about this story. The Rebbe was very involved with the Israeli government officials and the military. The Rebbe had a very deep and confidential discussions with all members of the Israeli government on very high levels. This story took place connected to one such incident in the spring of 1990, which is a perfect expression of this topic that we're discussing right here. There we go.
An excerpt from the Jewish educational media film Faithful and Fortified, Volume 3, Israel's Government Leaders. Rabbi Benjamin Klein is a member of the Rebbe's Secretariat.
Ik ben van mij het zeggen, kalt dat telefoon, geef hem een telefoon, kalt dat, Shami wil redden met me. Het takke kalt Rubinstein. Also, als we zo aankomen naar die, als de Ashraf gaat bombarderen naar zachtplaats, niet in één plaats. Maar we wisten in plaats, kunnen ze brengen. In de wereld, in de zachtheid in de wereld. Beter abrochen. Ik ga gewoon klap naar hem sturen, daar heb ik me gegeven. En dan zeggen die mensen, daar heb ik toch niet meer wisten, die gewoon niet. Ik heb ook het mensen, ja, naar bed niet. Ze komen bij mij, ik kan het niet wisten, ik kan het in office niet zijn, ze zeggen niet dat ik in een office. En dan ga ik gaan, komt ze mij, daar hebben ze wel staan met ook, en daar hebben het zich ooit gedreid nog meer, en dan gaan we redden wegen de mij.
So gekommen eine Idee, schon von Mincha, als Oshof hat auch gegeben, bei zu der Machloki sein, der Bechol Mokim Shuhu, als Hoyu Lissi, soll sich schäppen mit Zähne Israel und schäppen sich, wie bei sie kommt, der schäppen sich, hat das Ayini verbunden mit Guf, Bechule, wilde Haarig, Bedover, Hamepulsam, und beflatlich auf Tiftach Pär, Bemeli doch verstandig, aber es darf mächtig sein. Israel ein Kirche mehr Pär, wenn er geht zu Kolonionen verbunden mit Pär, unheimlich. Von dem wir da gesoffen, die wir da teilen, was Moduschkide. Es doch verstandig, dass er Eker mit Kore, Kolonionen Bildschirr zu ihm, wie andere haben gesehen, der Hapech hat durch Rusel zukommen, gießen Oil, mit Nachescher, und gießen nach Hochma, mit Nachsichlos.
Ja, dann hebt dan zu gucken, einer guckt da rein. Das ist eine Sache, private Sache, ne? Darauf wollte ich mal sagen, die 2 Schätzchen gekommen, ja, aber sie das gewinnen. Da wird gerät, und da geht es raus. In New York Times nicht wenn von dem Reben. New York Times sagen sich, ich gewinne News, weil in der Zeit nicht wussten die News, das soll gewinne News. Also sie gewinnen als das Sache. Als in New York Times, ich stand am Morgen, als mit Gewalt bombardieren, weißt du, dass es gewonnen ist. Aber nicht weil der Rebbe, nicht der gestern.
Der Pfarrer sagt, Massim, hat die Walda Chabad sich nicht mehr in den Jahren von Tinies. Aber viele, wenn das verbunden ist mit der Halacha, mit der Minig und verbalten das mit Bizdoko-Präg Und viele das ich kommen, trachten gut, wird sein gut. Aber du soll nicht niger werden, has wir schon. In Kamus als Docker, ich nicht in Neches als Docker. Und nicht mäßig sein. In dem Juche, bei Kescher Lose, am Methodologien, der Schovi, der Wert von Gimel Sudeis, und ich bin der Geist, Kolpon, sagen Gimel, mis mehr Teilen von ihm, mir das Israel. Und Martin drauf Kehl sein oder Mäßig sein, die müssen wir heracheln bei Asium, was entweder, was verendigt sich, und das ist der Chesem, wenn Kehl am Schomet, Halle, Jutke, Halleluke.
So what we have here is a perfect example of this idea that we're discussing in the class here on how to respond to a situation of anti-Semitism. Here's a Rebbe who receives confidential information from Prime Minister Shamir that they just got word that there's PLO is planning an attack. And the Rebbe lets the entire community know an hour later that the PLO is planning an attack. And what's the first thing the Rebbe says? First thing, don't focus on the negative. We're not going to discuss it because we don't discuss negative things. I'm mentioning it, what happened. I'm not getting into the details because it's not important. Next, the Rebbe says, don't panic. Don't be worried. What should we do instead? Trust in God, strengthen our relationship with God. And how do we do it? By taking appropriate action. What can we do? In that case, the Jews in the United States, what can they do from a PLO attack that they have no control about? What should they do? Strengthen, step up their game in studying Torah, in adding in prayer and saying the Psalms, and giving to charity. A clear example of what we're talking about in this class. So thank God that situation didn't materialize. It didn't happen. There was no bomb at that point. But it's a concrete example of what we're talking about in this lesson. We need less panic, less negativity. We need more faith, more optimism. And then we can think about how to act. And how do we act? We have to be more like Esther. We have to create a garment, which is a requirement of the Torah. We each have to make a garment, each community, each person, with the experts in the fields who they consult, and we have to do that to make that garment. But together with that garment, or perhaps more importantly, is to know that a garment is just that, it's just a garment. It's not the essence of our response. The essence of our response individually and as a community means that, like Esther, we have to strengthen our spiritual response internally and externally by studying more Torah and doing more mitzvahs. And so perhaps we should ask this question to us when we encounter a situation like that, or we encounter ourselves thinking about it. What can we do to be more like Esther?